After the first oil shock of the 1970s, economies across the world were suffering, and global leaders wanted to do something about it. So a group of government officials decided to meet up and figure things out. At first, it was just 6 countries: France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the US, and the UK. The next year, Canada joined and G7 was formed. In 1998, Russia joined the club, making it the G8, but it was kicked out in 2014 after its annexation of Crimea. So now we're back to G7. The countries in attendance typically discuss broad issues like climate change, jobs of the future, and women's empowerment. However, the G7 is an informal group, so what's said during meetings isn't binding. They're more of an opportunity for leaders to exchange ideas. But there are some other notable global powers missing from the G7 table, like China and India, which has led some to say the group isn't representative of the world powers at large. The G20 got its official start in 1999 after a series of global financial crises. All of the G7 countries and Russia were invited, along with financial leaders from another 11 countries and the EU. As of 2018, G20's members represent 85% of global economic output. But some critics still see it as unrepresentative of the world's population. So, G7 is mainly politics. It was only called G8 when Russia was involved. The G20 is mainly money, and it's made up of way more countries.
This union of 12 nations became known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or more simply, NATO. These men and their countries have sometimes been at war with each other. Often, they have been united against a common enemy. But here in NATO, for the first time in history, they are united in peace and for peace.
So our message is clear. We are united in condemnation of these barbaric and despicable acts. They should be very clear. These terrorists, their threats will only harden our resolve to stand up for our values and to defeat them.
And it sends a clear message to any potential aggressor. Should you even think of attacking one ally, you will be facing the whole alliance.
The European Union is a big old beast of 28 countries, with even more trying to get in. But where did it all start? It's 1945, and Europe is in ruins after World War II. The British Prime Minister Winston Churchill calls for a United States of Europe. But he doesn't want to be part of it. The idea was to bind the nation so tightly together that a future war would be impossible. Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg signed up to the European Steel and Coal Community. Coal and Steel. An organisation that will eventually morph into the EU. But that's for later. For now, it made trade between the countries easier. In the late 1950s, it was given a rebrand to the European Economic Community. Catchy. And feeling a little bit left out, Britain decides it wants in after all. But the French said no, or no. And no again. Eventually, though, they were allowed to join, along with a couple of others, and even more countries followed in the 1980s. Another name change was followed by new laws and a decision to scrap passport checks at border controls. Known as the Schengen Agreement, it meant theoretically you could walk all the way from Portugal to Estonia without any identification. But Britain didn't like this idea and carried on with its own border control. It also said no to the euro, a single currency to be used by most member states. Since then, another 13 countries have joined, to take the total up to 28.
To keep the global economy running smoothly, 189 member countries work together to promote financial stability, prevent crises, and facilitate trade through the International Monetary Fund. The IMF does this by tracking the economic pulse of each of its member countries, by collecting and evaluating data, and providing advice on sound economic policies to benefit the health of the world economy as a whole. It also lends money in times of crisis. Countries in need can turn to the IMF to borrow money from its members to alleviate a crisis and return to stability. And in collaboration with member countries and other partners, the IMF shares its experience by training people on the ground on good policy making and helping them build stronger institutions with the aim of achieving stronger economic growth. In the wake of the global financial crisis, the IMF is evolving to meet other challenges confronting the global economy, taking on issues such as the role of women in the workforce, inequality, climate change, and money laundering. This collaboration and sharing of information from huge land masses to tiny island nations is an example of what the founders of the IMF intended: countries of the world working together for the good of all.
While the World Bank, like many other international organizations, was created in the aftermath of World War II. In 1944, as the war was coming to an end, allied nations, including the United States and the United Kingdom, created the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or IBRD, to rebuild Europe. In 1947, this bank issued its first loan to France, which had been heavily bombed during the war, and it financed similar initiatives throughout the 1940s and 50s. Eventually, the IBRD became known colloquially as the World Bank. In the early 1970s, as post-war reconstruction was winding down, the World Bank shifted its focus to reducing global poverty. Instead of funding only construction projects like building dams and generating electricity, the bank oversaw programs related to food production, health, nutrition, and development, all addressing poor communities. By the early 1980s, the World Bank wasn't only made up of finance and infrastructure experts like economists and engineers, but also society-focused experts like anthropologists and social scientists. These experts not only collaborate on infrastructure projects, but work with local governments on policies and institutions that bring people out of poverty. For instance, in India, the World Bank has funded the construction of nearly 10,000 miles of roads that connect poor rural communities to schools, markets, and clean water sources. The projects stimulated rural economies and improved quality of life for thousands of people. In the past 45 years, the World Bank's objectives have largely remained unchanged. The bank's two stated goals are to reduce extreme poverty, that is, people living on less than roughly $2 a day, and to raise incomes of the poorest 40% of the population. It plans to do this by issuing low-interest loans and low to zero-interest credits and grants to developing countries. Oftentimes, the World Bank funds initiatives on its own, but it also partners with governments, private banks, and other organizations like the World Trade Organization or the UN.
The World Trade Organization, WTO, is the only global international organization dealing with the rules of trade between nations. At its heart are two WTO agreements negotiated and signed by the bulk of the world's trading nations and ratified in their parliaments. The goal is to help producers of goods and services, exporters and importers conduct their business. The WTO was formed in 1995 to enforce the regulations established by the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, and several other international trade agreements. Composed of representatives from 150 nations and observers from additional nations, it regulates international trade with the goal of helping it to flow as smoothly and freely as possible. Advocates praise the WTO for helping to create an increasingly global economy and bring prosperity to developing nations through increased trade. Critics, however, assert the industrialized nations such as US, Canada and the countries of the European Union have used the WTO to open trade with developing nations while disregarding these nations' environmental and labor-related practices.
So imagine a world parliament. Imagine 193 voices gathering together in New York to deliberate over matters of peace and security. The United Nations was established in 1945 with the signatory of 50 countries for the express purpose of preventing the outbreak of war and averting a world war. The United Nations has many parts to it. It deals, for instance, with matters of economics and social policy. It deals with matters of human rights. It deals with matters of culture. But the most important parts of the UN are the Security Council, which has 5 permanent members who are responsible for controlling its policy. These are France, Britain, the United States, China, and Russia. The other body that is very important is where all the nations meet and come together, and that is the General Assembly. Both the General Assembly and the Security Council pass what are called resolutions to make policy for the world. The UN has been responsible for eradicating polio in Africa, for instance, of dealing with problems of debt or problems of other diseases spreading. The UN has been very important in making sure that human rights are observed. The most famous document is the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which has been ratified and kept by many countries. The UN, precisely because it's so complex, is determined to make sure that everything is done towards a big picture of peace and trying to make sure that humanity attains the primary purpose of what it says, that we believe. We believe in a better future.
What is the World Health Organization? The World Health Organization, also known as WHO, is a specialized agency of the United Nations and is devoted to international public health. But how did we get here? Well, WHO was established on April 7, 1948, with 61 countries having signed its constitution in 1946. It is now headquartered in Geneva in Switzerland and operates through offices in over 150 countries. WHO employees work side by side with governments and several partners to strive for the highest attainable health for all people. But how does the World Health Organization pursue that goal? WHO provides leadership, shapes the research agenda, and sets and promotes health norms and standards. WHO also monitors the world health situation and related trends. The budget on which the WHO operates is mainly supplied by its member states and partly by voluntary contributions. WHO's current priorities include, but are not limited to, communicable diseases like HIV, AIDS, Ebola, malaria, non-communicable diseases like cancer or heart diseases, substance abuse, and also sexual and reproductive health.
Are done. Keeping it on till the day stays strong. Rolling till the nighttime blazes on. All along I keep singing my song. I say this phase is always. Sometimes I get so crazy, but just know that I'll always stay. 'Cause you're my light through the haze. It's time for a champion. Soothe the soul of the land. Mend the heart from the sea and sand till the sun comes up again. Time for a champion. The soul of the land, and the heart from the sea and the sand, till the sun comes up again. Reach for the sky, keep your eye on the prize. Forever in my mind, be my golden sunshine. It's waiting in your mind, so push them clouds aside. Forever by my side, my golden sunshine.
The World Wildlife Fund is an international, non-governmental organization founded April 26, 1961 by Victor Stolen, Julian Huxley, and Max Nicholson in an effort to protect endangered animals. Today, it is known globally as the Worldwide Fund for Nature, and its goals have expanded significantly. Once the founding document, known as the Morge Manifesto, was produced, the WWF opened its first office months later in Morge, Switzerland, on September 11, 1961. On that date, the organization was registered as a charity, and its mission to raise funds for wildlife conservation began. The WWF now works with businesses, banks, scientists, and other groups on their campaigns as well. As climate change becomes an increasingly significant issue, Earth Hour is one example of an annual event organized by the WWF that raises global awareness. By working with locals and non-governmental organizations to learn about how cultures affect the environment, the group also encourages countries to invent their own conservation strategies.
We are clean water that saves lives in a time of crisis, and we are irrigation that nourishes community gardens for years to come.
We support farmers who grow more with less,
and innovators who find new ways to feed their communities.
We listen for the best ideas and help them flourish.
We invest in small businesses that make a big difference.
We call on leaders and corporations to use their influence and fix what's broken.
We stand with citizens who are not afraid to speak out against injustice.
And we raise the voices of those who fight poverty and hunger.
We are Oxfam America, and you are here.
This organization is famous and infamous for its unconventional approach to saving the world.
Excuse me, but please stop killing the whales. Stop killing the whales.
Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be learning more about Greenpeace. Founded in Vancouver, British Columbia in 1971, Greenpeace is an international environmental group. As part of its mission, Greenpeace claims itself as the voice for a voiceless Mother Earth. Greenpeace was originally founded as a means to stop underground nuclear testing in an area of Alaska that was home to a number of endangered animal species. Though the grassroots organization failed to stop the United States from detonating that original bomb, its existence initiated a flood of public interest. The group officially became Greenpeace in 1972 after the U.S. government had stopped testing in that Alaskan region. By the mid-1970s, the organization had branched out from exclusively protesting nuclear weapons to fighting other environmental causes as well. These included whaling and toxic waste. By 1977, factions of the organization began operating across the world. Greenpeace has since evolved from its grassroots beginnings to become an organized group with offices in over 40 countries. Today, the organization is based in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and claims 2.8 million supporters around the world. Part of the Greenpeace mandate from the beginning has been to eliminate all nuclear weapons and put an end to our reliance on non-renewable resources. Its main goal is to stop climate change, and the group is credited with raising public awareness of that issue markedly throughout the 1990s. In addition to protesting and raising awareness, Greenpeace has also used its own laboratories to research and locate alternative solutions to ongoing problems. This effort has included the invention of GreenFreeze, a technology for fridge manufacturing that eliminates the use of ozone-depleting CFCs. Today, over 1/3 of refrigerators produced are based on this technology.